Hi everybody, hello, welcome. Thanks for joining us today. This is the third and final part of our webinar that we've been running over the last few weeks called Unprecedented. And today we're going to be looking at how COVID-19 has changed the way that we stay informed and how we are educating ourselves using social channels. So that's the topic for today. I just want to just share with you that a lot of the setup that we're going to go through today is sort of similar to the last two sessions that we've been through. So if you've joined us for the last two sessions, some of the upfront stuff will be the same, but then when we get into the trends, that's where there's going to be some differences. We will, after today, be sending through the decks and the recordings for all three sessions to all attendees. So you can receive that in your email inboxes. So just jumping into today and to introduce who we are today. Myself, I'm Mobbie Nazir. I'm the Global Chief Strategy Officer at We Are Social. And I'm going to be joined today by, as ever, by Law Oxford, who is our Global Head of Cultural Insights. Do you want to say a quick hi, Law?
Yeah, thanks for joining.
Great. So just to remind you all, this series is part of our ongoing series of thought leadership. We have been producing reports and insights into social and digital for many years. Some of you might be familiar with our global digital report that looks into digital behaviours and consumption across 200 plus markets. So it's a really big study that we produce every year that we update quarterly. We also do a lot of cultural and trend analysis. So we've been doing our annual Think Forward report for the last couple of years, 5 years, I think. And then this year we've been, obviously in the last couple of weeks and months, really looking into the COVID-19 situation and how that's changing people's behaviours. So we had a weekly series called In Lockdown, and we also had a report at the start of all of this called Do the Right Thing, which was really helping brands understand how they should navigate the massive changes that we were seeing in the space during this time. In terms of the clients that we work with a number of very sort of pioneering and global brands across the world. All of our research feeds into the work that we do with our clients and the kind of creative solutions that we provide for them. And all of our research is very much designed for brands to take an action in their day-to-day marketing strategies and approaches and to help them really understand how their audiences and consumers are changing and how they are using digital and social channels in new and innovative ways. So just to mention quickly why we call this report series Unprecedented. As I'm sure everyone's aware, it's a term that's been really heavily used during this period to describe what's going on. This is a chart from our latest Global Digital report update, which shows uses of the term unprecedented skyrocketing. But we thought it's quite an interesting term because I suppose it suggests that what we're seeing during this time is entirely new. That's what unprecedented really means. But actually, when you look at some of these behaviours, the reality is that some of these are actually amplifications of things that have already been happening, or they are existing motivations that were already there. So it's interesting when you assess these behaviours to think about which of these might be for the longer term and which are really shorter term, to have that overlay of, is it existing behaviour or motivation, or is it something new? So that's why we call the report series Unprecedented. As I said, this is the third in, our programme. The first one we talked about was how people are using social to connect, which we did 3 weeks ago. The one that we covered last week was how our people are using social media to stay entertained. And then finally this week, we're going to be looking at how people are using social media to stay informed. So that's the focus for today. So just to kind of talk a little bit about the methodology that we've used for this report series and how we gathered the information. First of all, we have a network of offices all around the world. We have 15 offices globally. And in each of our offices, we have people who are identified to spot cultural trends. They are deeply involved in internet culture and they understand what's happening. That they are our social spotting network. And we tapped into them to understand how these behaviours in each of these areas of connection, entertainment, and now information have been changing in each of our different markets. So it's really interesting to get those local nuances because obviously there are differences in behaviour from market to market. But when you gather them all together, what's also interesting is to see what are the global trends and any commonalities. So, that was our first port of call for this research series is our social spotting network that we have established across our network. And then the next thing that we did was filter all of our findings through an expert panel. So throughout this series, we've been collaborating with a media psychologist and brand consultant, Dr. Tanisha Singleton. She's been really great to provide a sort of psychological perspective and behavioral perspective on some of these trends. We've also been collaborating with different clients and brands along the way. So, and every week we've tried to, sort of select a brand that is really relevant to the topic that we have at hand. So this week's brand is actually Mary Kay. They are an American beauty brand. They operate in 40 different countries. They operate similarly to Avon, if you're familiar with them as a business. They are a network of independent sellers who purchase independent sellers of beauty products who purchase inventory from the company and then run their own business selling that inventory. But obviously, beauty is an industry that relies really heavily on being able to inform and educate potential consumers about their products and the benefits of those products. And so that's why we spoke to Whitney. She's a global social and influencer marketing manager at Mary Kay, and she's contributed across this week's research as well. And then finally, we filtered all of the findings through our group heads of strategy across all of our different markets. So Harvey Cassell in the UK, Werner in Singapore, Bruno in Italy as well. So a truly kind of global and expert perspective that we filtered all of the trends through. So jumping into how are people's behaviours around gathering information and staying educated during this pandemic shifting, we've identified kind of three major broad trends that all of the kind of detailed behaviours that we're going to talk about fall under. So the first is, how are people keeping up with current affairs and news during the crisis? So we've seen massive changes in this during this time. The platforms themselves, social media platforms themselves have launched specific products to try and help keep people informed. So things like Facebook introduced a Covid-19 information center. But also the use of social media platforms for news generally has increased globally. But the most significant growth we've seen is with Instagram, especially amongst 18 to 24-year-olds. So now 28% of that audience say they use Instagram for their news, but that's actually even higher in certain markets. So in Germany, it's 38%, and in Argentina, it's nearly 50% using Instagram for their news. So that's been quite a massive shift during this time. The next area we've seen big changes in is the use of social channels to upskill and to learn. LinkedIn have seen, 7.7 million hours of LinkedIn courses globally being used in April. That's almost triple the amount that was watched in February. Their key motivations that they talk about in accessing this content is advancing their career, but also learning to change their career path. So people are trying to pivot from what they were doing before to something new. And also, interestingly, in April, almost 10 times as many people watch mindfulness and stress management courses on LinkedIn Learning as compared to February. And obviously, remote working searches have also increased. So it's interesting to see how people are using learning to not just to adapt to this new situation they find themselves in professionally, but also mentally. And then the final area in which we've seen a lot of changes is in the use of social when it comes to researching brands and products. So social has been closing the gap on search when it comes to being the primary channel for researching brands and products for a while now. But what was really exciting was that during this time, we saw that for the first time amongst 16 to 24-year-olds, social actually became the primary channel for research. So actually tops search for the very first time. So I think that's a really significant moment in the role of social channels when it comes to finding and learning about new brands and products. But, whilst social has democratized our access to information, and people are turning to it in increasingly large numbers to stay informed, it's also led to a rise in misinformation. And during this period, 74% of the global population have said they are concerned about fake news relating to COVID-19. You know, misinformation is hitting us from every angle, from influencers, from organizations, our peers that are sharing information that hasn't been verified. So I think during this time, trusted sources are becoming ever more important. So, you know, in this environment, lots of new behaviors have emerged in terms of how people are using social channels. But it's really hard to kind of predict in this particular environment which of these are going to stay and which of these are going to be temporary. You know, the situation that we're in is still, you know, very much in flux. You know, economies are opening and closing down. We're coming in and out of lockdown in different markets. We're seeing spikes in the virus. So, you know, we're still very much in a period of uncertainty and anxiety around all of this. So, you know, it is difficult to sort of predict what the future looks like. However, what we can do is, you know, interrogate some of the most interesting behaviors that we're seeing and make some educated guesses. So we created a framework. This is the same framework that we've used throughout the series, and I'll just take you quickly through it. But this is what we're using to help map out the behaviors and really work out which ones are the most interesting for the future. So the first axis that we're looking on is this an existing behavior? Is it something we've seen pre-COVID? Or is this genuinely a new behavior? And then the second axis is this an existing motivation? So is this an existing reason why people are doing things? Or are we seeing new motivations emerging from the crisis? And I think that's what's really interesting to look at is the new motivations that are coming through the crisis and the new things that people are valuing. And then this leads to 4 different quadrants. So the first quadrant is what we're calling amplification. So these are behaviors that are existing, they're existing motivations. So actually they're just amplifying what we had seen before. An example of this from the kind of food industry would be home delivered groceries. So yes, we've seen a massive spike in those during this time, but this is something people were doing before, and it was an existing motivation around convenience. So yes, we've seen a spike, but that's really just an amplification of something we had seen before. The next quadrant is what we're calling substitutes. So these are existing motivations, but new behaviors. So these are people doing things in new ways, but they're just replacing things that they wanted to do prior to the crisis. So an example of that, again, from the food industry would be the digital supper clubs that we've seen set up during these times. So people have always wanted to meet their friends and go out and, you know, eat out and socialize. They can't go out now, so they've been setting up digital supper clubs instead. So this is a substitute behavior. The next quadrant is what we're calling adaptations. So these are existing behaviors, but new motivations. So these are quite interesting to look at. And an example of that, again, from the food industry would be immunity boosting foods. So prior to the crisis, you know, we saw a lot of interest in health foods in general. There's been, you know, for a while an uptick in interest around those. But, you know, specifically due to the pandemic, we've seen this increase in interest around immunity boosting. It's a new motivation. You know, concerns around viruses were not that high prior to this. So that's why we're calling it an adaptation. And then the final category of behaviors that we'll be looking at today are deviations. So these are really interesting. These are new motivations and new behaviors. And so finally, an example of that would be a restaurant meal kits. So, you know, restaurants who, you know, are struggling to get people in through their doors, sending out kits to people to be able to make those meals at home. So it's a new motivation, it's a new behavior. It's not something that people necessarily did before. It's not something that restaurants did before, but actually people are seeing benefits. They're learning to cook things in new ways. They're getting access to, you know, Michelin-starred chefs in ways that they hadn't done before. So there's a possibility that some of these sorts of things might actually stick around for the longer term. So our hypothesis is that the most interesting developments are those that are going to be on the right-hand side of this grid. You know, the ones that speak to genuine new motivations, whether it's an existing behavior or new behavior is maybe less important. What's really interesting to look at is what are the new reasons or values that people have coming out of the crisis. And I think it's important to look at because the crisis has made us reevaluate so many things about our lives. and has made us realise, some of the things that we might have been taking for granted in the past that we don't want to in the future, or different priorities that we really want to make sure we have for the future. So this is why those behaviours that sit at that side of the framework we think are most interesting. So we're going to go through specifically when it comes to how people are staying informed and educating themselves using social channels, which are the trends that we are seeing that are the most interesting in social, and where are they mapped across this framework. So I'm going to hand over to Laura to take you guys through that.
Hi, perfect. Thank you for that introduction, Mobbie. Thank you for taking the time to maybe go through that framework again or seeing it for the first time. And also, if you have any questions about any of the trends that I'm going to be talking about in the coming few minutes, then feel free to just drop questions in and we'll be answering those at the end. So we've got 5 behaviours that we've pulled out that we've been seeing on a global scale that our spotting network was seeing kind of come about in different ways in their markets. And the first of these is expert influence. So this is about people looking to influencers who have proven expertise in a given topic. And so I think this is kind of latching onto something that we've been seeing happening in recent years around the influencer economy, where historically it's been driven by aspiration and aesthetics, and especially on platforms like Instagram and TikTok to a certain extent, we're seeing people kind of fall out of favour, perceived maybe as too shallow, maybe seen as too brand centric. And then during Covid-19, this was obviously supercharged. There were so many articles at the beginning of the crisis that were like, is this the end? Is this the death of influencers? And they've really been under a microscope, coming under fire from everything from posting vacuous content to leaving the house and kind of setting a bad example to their followers, and also spreading misinformation, which has been a huge part of this. And so in this landscape, the figureheads that have thrived have been the ones that offer genuine expertise. And actually a study from GWI showed that trustworthiness has become the top ranked trait since the outbreak began, with 46% of people now saying it's important for influencers and creators to be trustworthy. And so in terms of where we're seeing it, he's not exactly an influencer, or at least not exactly by choice, but Dr. Fauci in the US became an international or a national hero rather during the height of the first wave as a source of like calm, reliable advice at a time where it felt like there was a lot of misinformation, not even just coming from influencers, but coming from governments and kind of miscommunications from various health organizations as well. Then beyond the crisis, COVID-19, we've also seen expertise kind of held up in other spaces. So when at the height of the kind of media cycle around Black Lives Matter a couple of months ago, Selena Gomez, Lady Gaga, and a few other celebrities, Katie Couric, basically noticed that they had a huge amount of influence, but instead of just posting the black square, they gave anti-racism experts their platforms during this time, so people had reliable insight coming from those sources. So again, Selena Gomez gave her platform to one of the founders of BLM to really try and make sure that we were getting authoritative opinion around that subject. We've seen doctors come out in other spaces as well. So Dr. Elwoma has been huge in the UK. She's a dermatologist who's been posting a lot around skincare expertise during lockdown. And this is something that we've seen happen a lot in Germany and France and other places across Europe as well. And then French fashion brand Cézanne has also been giving its platform on Instagram quite regularly to Marie Roberts, who is a professor of philosophy, to help its following make sense of life in lockdown. And even we're seeing this happen constantly. So there's a bus outside my window. Apologies for that. But we're even seeing this. So in following the explosion in Beirut, there have been a lot of maps kind of trying to compare the size of the explosion there to London. And a cartographer went viral on Twitter this morning for posting an actual accurate map. So we're seeing this happen increasingly around crises where a lot of information is kind of being shared kind of quite ad hoc on social platforms. And this is something that Whitney kind of taps into as well when she says scientists and experts are so coveted right now, and people are turning to social media for candid discussions with them. Designers, artists, scientists, founders who may have previously not at all even been active on social are all popping up in Q&As across the board. So we've mapped this out as an adaptation. As I mentioned before, we have seen a desire for more specialized creators rise off the back of the influencer backlash for some time. So it feels like it's part of an existing behavior, but of course there's so many new motivations for this now. So as Verna notes, there's always been a space for people who know what they're talking about online, maybe not so much around healthcare, because that's much stronger now for obvious reasons. But if you look at any how-to video, usually you find people making those videos do know what they're talking about. And this is also about the democratization of knowledge during a period of great uncertainty. And I think it's a really, really interesting point from Tanisha. So we're redefining what should and shouldn't be behind a paywall right now. People are so starved of answers because of the lockdown, the pandemic, and the sheer volume of information. The experts are stepping up to provide insight in digital spaces. So in terms of what this means for brands, in the short term, it's going to, of course, have huge implications on how we choose influencer partners. Brands will be choosing more reliable partners who can deliver opinion and insights around their products and services and industries with authority. And in the new normal, we're likely to see this stick across industries, whether it's fashion or food. There will still, of course, continue to be a place for relatable content from real people, DIY, and so on. But more space will also open up for expertise to play a role. And against that backdrop, we could also see long-term influencer partnerships become more common, in which the work of the creator is further legitimized by the pure length of the partnership. Which kind of leads quite nicely on to my next one, which at the flip side is about everyday DIYers. So this is about people learning to recreate the little luxuries of life before lockdown. So previous to Covid-19, as Mobbie mentioned, this is a huge period of reassessment. There were so many aspects of everyday life, from getting your nails done to eating out of restaurants, that required the service of skilled professionals. And then obviously when lockdown first started, those aspects of life have been put on hold. And so people are using digital channels to learn how to recreate the ones they miss the most from home. And actually 40% of consumers in this same GWI study that I mentioned before said that they wanted to see more how-to videos in their feeds, making it one of the most in-demand content formats at this time. And we're seeing this play out in a ton of different ways. The kind of main one that springs to mind immediately is the DIY haircuts and dye jobs that went viral during the first weeks of lockdown. There were a ton of interesting hair care brands that really kind of stepped in to kind of help people make less of a mess of their haircuts. We've also been seeing people use how-to videos across platforms to learn how to do home DIY. There's a study in the UK that showed more than half of Brits, from spending so much time at home, started noticing all the jobs that needed to be done during lockdown. And we're seeing those pop up, again, not just on YouTube, where this kind of content kind of already has a very natural home, but across platforms in new and interesting formats too. In Australia, a company called Fantastic Cleaners has been killing it by providing how-tos and guides for people to conduct antiviral cleans in their homes. So this is again about at a time where there's a lot of anxiety around hygiene and around germs, really having like expert insight into how to do a proper, rigorous antiviral clean from your home. And then this is one of my favorite examples probably in this whole deck. An amazing example of DIY recreations. So Uber Eats and Carrefour, the supermarket, partnered with Burger King in France to launch a DIY Whopper that you could get delivered and then make yourself from home. So we're really seeing a ton of different, very creative ways that people are kind of recreating these experiences from the comfort of their homes. So we map this as a substitute because, you know, these behaviours are definitely new. And to begin with, at least, certainly, and for many of these, they are serving existing motivations that couldn't be met during lockdown. So as Bruno says, in the short term, this has been about teaching people how to do things that they want or need to do. It was born out of necessity or desire, you know, like a Whopper. Once Burger King reopens, it's highly unlikely we're going to continue to be making Whoppers, right? But then at the same time, the reason we've mapped it so close to the y-axis is because we could see some long-term impact in certain spaces. So as Tanisha says, once this is over, people will rush back to all of these experiences that they've been recreating from home. but what they've invested time and cash into will still be there. And we'll see people reap the benefits of the things that they've done by themselves from home during this time as well. So while this definitely is a substitute, we could see people maintain, some of these skills as hobbies. It could create certain passions, and it could also see them kind of invest in their homes in new ways as well, whether that's refurbishing furniture or doing your own nails from home. So what this means for brands, in the short term, there are so many ways for brands to help people recreate the little details of everyday life from home. I think this is a real opportunity to kind of educate products as well about the kind of educate consumers about the products and services that they're using at a time when they're really open to listening and learning, so that they can really use them to the full extent themselves from home. And then that will kind of lead into a potential new normal for certain businesses. So for businesses that have previously only offered out-of-home services, this period could serve as an opportunity to build out a more permanent space for people within the home. And so adapting so people can enjoy the experience of that product will also kind of be something that people remember and really appreciate. So it could transform certain customers into genuine brand fans or brand advocates in the long term as well. So I think this is really all about kind of using this as an opportunity to really get into people's homes and actually educate them about how to use your products properly from there. Next, we have Reskill now. So this is about, as kind of Mobbie mentioned loosely up front, people having been using this time to upskill and pivot their career prospects, because if not now, then when? Before COVID-19, we lived in a culture of productivity, and then bolstered by, uncertainty in economic prospects and a growing aversion to the conventional 9-to-5 among certain audiences, especially younger audiences. Side hustles, second jobs, and always on kind of digital upskilling have very much become part of the fabric of our society. But then during COVID-19, we saw the weight of the crisis kind of forced us to reassess what's important to us. And also for many, people are feeling anxious for their livelihood. So, we've got people who genuinely don't know if they're going to have a job to go back to. We've got people that really need to find kind of purpose during this time. And we've got people saying, I don't even like this job. Like, why am I doing this? And so compared with the abundance of time many people have had, they've been using it to upskill and reskill through a range of digital channels. And again, this really kind of tallies with some of the kind of other studies that we've seen. So there was a global study from a consultancy called Protein, which showed that there's been a real shift away from self-optimization and towards self-prioritization during this time, with 28% of people from that study agreeing that they're feeling resourceful and they want to use this time as an opportunity to think differently about the way they live their lives. So in terms of where we've seen it, there are a ton of interesting examples of this. So in Australia, the Federal Department of Education is actually working with education providers to develop kind of snappy 6-month courses to teach people engineering, mathematics, teaching, to really kind of support people in reskilling during lockdown, because actually Australia is one of the countries that consistently is ranking a lot of job anxiety right now. We've also seen Gen Zers who maybe weren't on a career path already for the younger set, using time in lockdown to really figure out what their creative prospects are in fashion, upcycling, customizing, and making their own clothes and selling them on platforms like Depop, Instagram, and TikTok. And we're also seeing brands like Dickies actually offer tutorials to kind of support them on social as well. In Dubai, we're seeing a lot of small businesses come up as people start to pivot. So Do It Yourself is a gourmet pizza kit business, which was started by a property developer who was looking to diversify his career prospects during lockdown at a time when people weren't investing so heavily in property. And then from a brand perspective, we've also got, so Nikon at the beginning of the first wave made its entire curriculum of online photography classes free. So we're seeing a ton of different ways that this is playing out through entrepreneurialism through to education as well. So we have mapped this as an adaptation because while it's a new behaviour for some, looking online to learn is not new. It's just that, as I mentioned before, new motivations have risen off the back of the crisis. So as Tanisha says, people have always looked online to learn, but now it's for a new reason. Some are bored and seeking purpose. Others are anxious about job security and finding new skills to survive. They're at opposing ends of the spectrum, but right now they're all flooding the same digital spaces to achieve very different things. And so in terms of what this means for brand, there's a huge opportunity for knowledge sharing right now. As the economic situation continues to unfold, we're still not entirely sure where we're going to land, and it's going to be different across markets as well. Brands that have aggregated value already through expertise, whether that's because they have industry specialists in-house or because they have the best tech, they have an opportunity to democratize access to their resources and really help people kind of learn in those industries. As we move forward, though, into the new normal and kind of, after a vaccine is eventually found, the desire and the time for upskilling and reskilling will dwindle for many, but the desire to learn and to grow, which existed before the crisis, will remain. And so off the back of this time, what we could really see happen in the long term is that people's perception of social platforms will shift. So while YouTube's role in learning will persist, we could see platforms like Instagram and TikTok legitimize more as educational resources. Onto our penultimate trend, virtual showrooming. This one is all about how people are trialing and researching products online. So previous to Covid-19, retail innovation had been increasing. Virtual retail experiences were more common. There'd been a lot of innovation in that space. But data has long suggested that people prefer offline shopping where possible, especially when it comes to big ticket items or important items. But during Covid-19 and during the first wave in particular, e-commerce has obviously skyrocketed. Many brands have been forced to adapt. And so without the ability to head to stores, people have been more open to virtual ways to research and experience products. So there are tons of interesting examples here. We've got the kind of Dior and Rimmel partnership in which they launched 3 Snapchat lenses, which basically let people visualize the collections in their worlds. Skoda's had a virtual showroom service for a while, but during the crisis, they basically got their specialists to give customers live demonstrations and maintenance advice directly from their own driveways, creating a much more intimate relationship with the car dealership, which isn't a category that's necessarily renowned for that kind of relationship. We've seen people using virtual dressing rooms more. Organizations like Bold Metrics and Forma are getting a huge amount of investment right now, which in turn is obviously making these products better and more user-friendly. And then lastly, we've seen more kind of live streaming attached to the retail experience. So Chinese e-commerce platform JD has seen a huge number of brands, Clarks, Philips, Havaianas, among just a few of them, using their retail staff to live stream new products to entice shoppers, almost like an in-platform QVC style service. And so this is another one which we have mapped as a substitute. So as Werner comments, it's a new behavior which is serving an existing desire to shop, right? And as Werner says, every brand that has a physical showroom is investing very heavily in AR and other innovations right now, doing whatever they can to really bring those experiences home. In the short term, brands simply need to create options for people who want to experience their products. But once people can go back to physical stores, as I mentioned before, they probably will. That being said, there are some ways in which we kind of think that there will be some long-term innovations, which again is why it's quite close to the y-axis. So as Tanisha says, this will pave the way to better online research of brands and products before people head into store. So it's like a trailer or a precursor to the offline retail experience. So now that we have these innovations, they're not going anywhere, and they will once again kind of complement the offline retail experience when we can go back. So until there's a vaccine, brands simply need to continue to adapt to consumer anxieties around physical retail spaces. So I think even with clothes, for example, there was a study in the UK that showed clothing stores are one of the places people were most anxious to return to as we started to move out of lockdown. And so with all audiences, even those in favour of physical retail, especially with older audiences where digital literacy might be an issue, I think it's really important to make sure that these interfaces are inclusive, as that will be integral to maintaining customers. And again, will be really good for building long-term relationships with these customers. So a great example of this is that Amazon has been doing a lot of like live streamed customer service where you can very quickly get through to a kind of real customer service representative, which is something that they've historically done with older audiences to great success. In the new normal, like I say, some of these innovations will stick, and some of them also point to a much more kind of entertainment-based form of e-commerce, especially when we look at how they're playing out on social platforms. And in the long term, we could see going shopping as a way to spend time with people, a much more normalized thing to do in digital spaces as well. On top of that, we could also see some of these functions start to be integrated more effectively into social platforms, for example, around live streaming products. And as that happens, we could see the consumer journey online become much more seamless. And this is something that Whitney echoed as well. So she said, we have various AR apps at Mary Kay for trying on makeup or analysing your skin to tailor product recommendations. And those apps are a highly valuable, immersive branded experience. But what they're also doing is exploring how they can meet makeup lovers where they already are by looking at AR options and other integrations in the social media experience, like on Instagram. So what we're seeing is that, yes, while apps are like an amazing way to do this, increasingly we're going to see the shopping journey and the brand experience happen much more in social platforms as well. Which leads me on to my last one, which is Infeed Advocacy. So this is part of a shift that we've seen during this time towards a much more kind of actionable form of online advocacy and activism, in which people are engaging with far more practical political resources on social. So previous to Covid-19, social media has long been used as a source of information and education around current affairs, again, especially platforms like Twitter and YouTube. But historically, it's been a place for commentary and conversation more than education in such an explicit way. So during COVID-19, people have been spending time that they've had creating reliable and actionable resources around socio-political movements, ensuring people are not just scrolling past information in this space, but genuinely engaging with it. And a lot of this is driven by the formats that we're seeing. So You Want to Talk About is a Instagram account which dissects politics and social issues and terminology like intergenerational trauma, for example, into educational Instagram carousels. And they source everything, all of the quotes, all of the data, all of the explanations, they source it all to more reliable sources. And they've racked up more than 1 million followers since June. So that's just under 2 months that it's taken them to rack up 1 million followers. And they have so many things on there, from anti-Semitism to intergenerational trauma, to white fragility, really helping people understand these terminologies, where they come from and what they really mean. Then there's been a huge uptick in kind of Google Docs being used as a tool in terms of outlining key anti-racist resources and learning plans, and they've been widely shared across platforms. And again, a huge amount of emotional labour and energy has gone into creating these resources too. We're seeing very practical kind of how-tos in terms of how to be an advocate online. So thousands of teenagers on TikTok mobilized via the app to organize a digitized boycott of Trump's 2020 campaign app, flooding it with negative reviews on Apple's App Store. And as you can see in this thumbnail here, the TikTok was literally like a step-by-step on how to get to the app, what to do when you got there. So again, very kind of practical resources in terms of how to actually do these kind of digital advocacy. And then in terms of how brands are using this, we're already seeing media outlets kind of clock on to the way that social channels are being used and starting to replicate it. So German TV channel ZD Info has been using the carousel format that we've been seeing across Instagram to create digestible 101s on all of the topics that they're covering on their show as well. So we've mapped this as a deviation. As Tanisha says, the issue of civil injustice isn't new, but the crisis has seen new motivations to participate emerge. We've seen, and we've kind of mentioned in previous webinars, this kind of disaster collectivism, where people really start to reconsider what causes they want to stand for off the back of crises. And as a result, these new motivations are driving new behaviours. So as Tanisha says, we're seeing new formats and spaces emerge to cater to these subjects. And as a result, more people and brands are finding reason to enter those spaces. They're taking a much more aggressive approach to consciousness and resource creation, finding actionable ways for people to learn and to contribute. And so in terms of what this means for brands, it presents a huge opportunity for brands to use long-form content to be transparent and offer education, not just around political subject matter, but around everything from, transparency around the ingredients being used, transparency around sustainability initiatives, transparency around diversity initiatives. People are more willing to actually invest time in reading these things and making sure that brands are holding themselves accountable. And to that end, we're likely going to see a lot of brands make commitments as a result during this time. And in an environment which is very much steeped in cynicism, it's going to be really important that those commitments are, it's better to make smaller, achievable commitments than to go big and then not be able to actually deliver. In the new normal, this behaviour does point also to a future where all social platforms become far more legitimate resources for social justice and news. For industries where it makes sense, there's an opportunity to kind of build out more hard-hitting feeds built around trustworthy information, because again, people really are going to these platforms to find it now. And in this landscape as well, we're likely to see likes and saves become more important, with people using these functions to save important content to come back to when they have time. Also, we're going to see some potentially interesting implications for how algorithms actually work. So Whitney talked about the fact that previously Mary Kay have had to steer away from text-heavy images because Facebook's algorithms would penalise you for this kind of content. And it'll be interesting to see how that will change as new kinds of content become more popular, and what the standards around how to promote things will look like as a result. So to recap, we've got people looking to influencers with proven expertise. We've got people learning how to recreate the little luxuries from home using digital channels. We've got people using this time to pivot their prospects. We've got people trialing and researching products from the comfort of their own home via social and digital channels. We've got people engaging with practical political resources on social. So, and when you see these all mapped out, you can see that they're kind of spread out everywhere. But on the far side, we've got expert influence, Reskill now, and Infeed Advocacy. So what unites these kind of most promising developments that we're seeing? So really what it points to is the fact that the way we use our social channels is diversifying. Driven by a fundamental shift in content needs during this time, people are realizing that there are so many different purposes that social can serve. And in this landscape, legitimate sources of information have found a place across platforms in all of these different spaces. So whether it's expert influencing, a legitimization of figureheads and influencers that we follow, this woman here is a gynecologist who has been posting really practical Q&As with her teenage following on TikTok. This is going to become much more common, I think, as we move forward. We've got Reskill now, which sees people using social and digital channels to maximize their career prospects. So this is I Love Creatives, which is an Instagram-based online learning resource. Then we've got Infeed Advocacy, which sees people educate themselves on political matters from within their feeds. So this screenshot here is from some books that help Mark Lamont Hill make sense of the moment at the beginning of the BLM crisis, with just book recommendations. So we're seeing all of these points of different ways in which we can use our social feeds to keep informed and educate ourselves across the board. And it points to a future in which the way people will engage with social will just have to evolve to accommodate these new needs. The way we use social right now isn't set up to deal with this much kind of reliable information being in our feeds. And we're already seeing this shift start to unfold. So TikTok hashtags like algebra and geometry place social platforms at the heart of education, and kind of point to a future where social will play a much more central role in schools and education, and maybe even to a future in which, you know, schools that less well-off kids would be able to get into because they didn't have access to tutoring, for example. Now maybe that will become less of a thing moving forward. We're seeing a spiking use of saves on platforms like IG, and also the way people organize those saves, you know, having a folder for learning, having a folder for shopping. We're going to have to kind of, now that people are actually saving things to look back on later, we're going to have to upskill and kind of upgrade the way that we actually organize our content to come back to. And already we're starting to see platforms like Facebook actually put out campaigns to educate people on how to be more discerning about the information they read in their feeds. Are you fact checking? Is it a reliable source? Where is the source from? Can you find the original source? So all of these point to kind of new behaviors that we're going to have to learn in order to have a healthy relationship with information on social platforms. And it's an uphill struggle, but it's going to be really interesting to see. Cool. So thank you so much for listening. I think we're going to move on to some questions now, which Mobbie is going to be in charge of.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Noel, and thanks for the really great questions that have been coming in. I'm just going to go through those one by one. So the first one is, do you think it's beneficial for brands to invest in teaching their customers things which have no real relevance to their offering, i.e. a fashion brand doing cooking tutorials? Or should learning always link closely with a brand's DNA? I mean, I think that's a really good question. It is something we've seen a lot of during this time, is not just brands, but also creators and influencers stepping out of their normal day-to-day content and trialing different topics and themes. I think it's been a great time to try out a few different things. The appetite for content during this time has obviously gone up. And, you know, even fashion brands, they are all part of a wider lifestyle. So I guess we would generally sort of, when we're looking at content for brands, be thinking not just about your own specific product and category, but within wider culture or within the wider lifestyle that your product or brand represents. What, you know, are there any other conversations that you could be part of? But one of the things we have seen, and we did an in-depth study with creators and influencers, is there's a kind of concern around the sustainability of some of the new topics that they've been stepping into. So, you know, for example, if you are a fashion blogger and you've now started talking about cooking, then, you know, that's nice for now because you're sort of inviting people into your life in a more personal way. But is that sustainable? And that is one of the things that creators have been telling us during this time, is they're a bit worried that it's been lovely to have all of this extra engagement and all of this extra content, but they don't necessarily feel it is sustainable for the longer term. So I think it's a balance. It's an opportunity to try out new things, but it isn't necessarily, it's something you need to look at in a longer term way as well. Is this something you really want to stand for the future? And absolutely, I think any kind of content that brands produce has to link back to their brand DNA in some way. Otherwise, it's really not going to be helping the brand with their longer term business objectives.
Yeah.
Those are my thoughts. Well, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's definitely something where I think now is the time where we've had an opportunity to really go dig down into our values. So, for example, if you're a food brand and maybe like at the core of your brand it's around like family and the home, now is a time where you could do like a live stream series in which you talk about lots of different aspects of that. And it could be like a family therapist, or it could be cooking, or it could be like how to change your spaces. And I think there has been legitimacy for brands to go down to their core values and then offer content and education around kind of peripheral topics that still link back to that heartland. But I think at the same time, yeah, there's a risk of kind of like scattergunning it and it not being consistent. So I think now has been the opportunity where we've had the chance to diversify, but making sure that, yeah, there is still focus within that. And there's a reason that links it back to the brand. I think that makes sense. But again, also, some brands have more legitimacy to do that than others. So fashion or lifestyle brands certainly have more opportunity to kind of go out of their remit than you would if you're a car brand, for example.
Yeah. So moving on to the next question, which is about the Infeed Advocacy trend that we talked about. Have you seen any brands do this other than publishers? I work at an FMCG brand, and we tend to stay away from this kind of narrative to avoid backlash, and also because it doesn't seem to fit with our everyday tone of voice. So yeah, very good question. I think it is something that's on a lot of brands' minds at the moment. I mean, we do see some brands, I mean, even in the FMCG space, being really active in this area, but they tend to be brands that this is already part of their values and it's already part of their DNA. So Ben & Jerry's would be a really good example of that. This is part of their belief system. And so when they step into this conversation, it makes entire sense. But yeah, I think it is an important one. It is an important consideration. I don't know, what are your thoughts, Laura?
Yeah, I think I agree. I think something that's very interesting about Infeed Advocacy is that this isn't just about you talking about social justice. Obviously, we did a bit of social listening recently, I think, which showed that, for example, supermarket brands that participated in BLM actually got a lot of backlash for talking about it from both sides, because some people were offended by it. Some people felt like, why was a supermarket talking about it? It felt like kind of virtue signaling. And I think what's interesting here, it's about using these formats and understanding that we can talk about bigger issues on social at length. So if you're a FMCG brand, it might be that you've just removed a harmful ingredient from one of your products, which has changed a formula. And usually you would never communicate about that on social, whereas now it could be like education, like, here's why you should avoid products that have this ingredient in, or whatever. So I think I think what this points to is more broadly from a formats perspective, there are so many ways that we can talk about more complex issues, from civil rights movements all the way through to sustainability with depth and value, rather than just trying to like squeeze it into like a tagline or having it hidden in the small print. So I think this points to a kind of bigger shift where people want brands to be more transparent about all of their work streams, and whether that be their diversity and their approach to civil rights movements, or whether it be something else, and that they are willing to engage with that on social channels if it's delivered in the right way.
Yeah. So final question, which is a really good one, considering we're at the end of a 3-part series. Of all the trends you've identified through the last 3 seminars, which one do you think will be the most impactful for marketers in general? So I'll answer that first. I've got 2 answers to that. I think firstly, in terms of the broad, every week we had a broad kind of concluding theme. And I think this week's concluding theme was probably the most important, around the diversification of the use of social channels. That applies to every brand in every category. The way that consumers are using social is changing. It isn't just short form content, it's long form content. They're spending longer there with deeper content, more educational, more informational. So I think that's quite a significant change, and it's a really exciting one for all brands to start thinking about how they tap into. And some of the comments that we got from our client Mary this week were really interesting, that the algorithms don't necessarily favor content that's heavily text-based, and they favor content that's more visual. And so those sorts of things, I think, are maybe going to point to quite an interesting and significant shift in how social is used. So it's not going to be one or the other, but more of a hybrid use of those platforms as they're becoming more and more embedded in our lives and how we make decisions day to day. And then if I was going to choose one individual trend overall, I'd go back to week 1. My favorite was actually intergenerational media. So those of you who joined us for week 1 will know what that is, but just to kind of explain it briefly, it's the trend that is about, different generations coming into social spaces together, in ways that they weren't before. So for example, TikTok, you now see multiple generations of people using, grandparents, parents, kids. And I think that's really exciting. It's so much more inclusive. And, I really feel that during this time, maybe some of the older generations that have discounted certain platforms or channels, or felt like, social wasn't really for them, have reassessed that, and they've seen some of the benefits. And I think that's a major shift for how marketers use social channels going forward as well. So those would be my 2 picks. I'll hand over to Laura for her thoughts.
Yeah, I certainly echo you. I think in the short term and in the now, the conclusion to this one is definitely the one where it feels like it's the biggest kind of fundamental shift that we're seeing, and it makes sense at a time where information has been so kind of uncertain and unreliable and just constantly changing, because the situation itself is unprecedented. It makes sense that the biggest shift in terms of actionable immediate implications is around information on social. I think moving forwards, I'm incredibly interested to see. The conclusion of the second one was around, one of the trends is called virtual selves, which is around how people are spending more of their time as avatars in digital spaces. And the conclusion was around how immersive technologies are moving out of the fringes and into the mainstream. And I think as we see, everything from platforms like Animal Crossing to, I said it last week and I'll say it again, when Facebook starts investing in a technology, it's about to kind of hit kind of mass usage, and Facebook's avatars as well. Very interesting to see as the next phase on our journey away from kind of anonymized identity online, where, my first email address was like dragonite89@hotmail.co.uk. And now the idea of my email not being my real name is absurd. My real name is shown on my Instagram. My real name is shown on my Facebook. And the next phase of that being really kind of visualizing ourselves in these virtual worlds, even if it's customizing your Memoji, not making a whole island on Animal Crossing. I think the way we start to self-actualize in digital spaces is going to be the big shift that we see in the next decade of social media. And so for a future facing trend, that's one that I'm really excited to see how it plays out, and how technologies which seem futuristic will play out in everyday ways where they kind of sneak up on us before we realize it. So I think that's very interesting. But I think from a brand perspective, yes, the conclusion of this one is the most interesting. And also, we've spoken a lot about fandoms over the course of this series, and I think seeing how communities of like-minded people have rallied together during this time and strengthened during this time will present a wealth of opportunities across the board for any brands, whether it's, you know, Netflix that has different shows where there are fandoms you can tap into, or food brands where people might be fans of specific recipes or products that you have. I think we are going to see the role of fandoms and communities increase as a result of that, and that's been really interesting to see as well.
Yeah, great. So we're out of time. Thank you everybody for joining us today, and we're now wrapping up the final part of this series. As I said at the start, we will send out all the decks today to attendees, and also the videos of all of these sessions as well. So I hope you've all enjoyed it. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for all your questions. Enjoy the rest of your days.
Thank you. Bye.